When we began studying the history of James Shields, we thought we would find the story of a hero.
When we first wrote our script for this episode, we expected to be telling the story of a hero.
History is more complicated than heroes and villains. It is humans interacting with humans and making individual moral choices.
There were details in the James Shields story which we could not overlook. We could not tell this story the same way it has been told for 150 years.
We had to tell the story this way.
I'm Sam Temple.
I'm Logan Ledman. Today on 1855, we're telling the story of James Shields, an Irish-American leader. A politician, soldier, and general, James Shields is remembered as the only American to serve as a U.S. Senator from 3 different states.
We're here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Minnesota was one of the states that Shields represented in the Senate.
Sam and I have been exploring and sharing Minnesota's history for the last 5 years. The topic of James Shields has piqued our interest from the beginning. We couldn't have imagined that this was how his episode would turn out.
Research for this episode was challenging. Actions on the battlefield and at the Capitol make to scale accounts of his life hard to find, and many sources on Shields' life disagree with each other in significant ways. It was hard to know what we could trust.
We do know that Anne MacDonald gave birth to her first child in Altmore, County of Tyrone in Ireland. She was from Scotland. Anne and her husband, the Irish Charles Shields, named their boy James around 1806. This is not James. Photography was not invented in 1806, but most babies look the same, so this is a good approximation.
Anne's experience adjusting to life in Ireland was one of subjugation and belittlement. As subjects of the British Empire, Irishmen were second-class citizens. No Catholic could serve in Parliament, its lawmaking body, and citizens were coerced into membership for the Church of England.
2 other siblings joined James and their mother in adapting to this life. They likely had no memory of their father. He died when James was only 6. For some time, it was just Anne and her children in the mountainous county of Tyrone.
Anne had high educational aspirations for her children. Her dream was for James to one day escape from his beginnings and study law. She watched as her son grew.
James shared a name with his uncle. Uncle James Shields had emigrated to the British colonies in America and fought for American independence in the Revolutionary War.
After teaching as a professor of Greek and Latin in South Carolina, Uncle James fought in the War of 1812. After this, he reconnected with his family in Ireland.
Uncle James began a years-long teaching relationship with his nephew. Eventually, he returned to America, but not before promising James a gold pocket watch with one condition: immigrate to the United States.
In 1822, James left Ireland. His voyage was ravaged by disaster. James suffered 2 shipwrecks on his voyage, one off the coast of Scotland and one in New York Harbor. He was one of only a handful of survivors of the first accident and was badly disfigured by the second.
Just as he arrived on the east coast of America, a rigging accident had left James with 2 broken legs. While healing, he discovered Uncle James had died.
The younger James taught school and studied law while recuperating, and passed the Illinois bar exam in 1832. He began building a law career in Kaskaskia, Illinois.
It was around this time that James entered military life. Sources disagree on what his role was. Most likely, he participated in the Black Hawk War in 1832 while he lived in Illinois. But it's worth mentioning that some sources claim he fought in the Second Seminole War. Although this war took place years later and in Florida, At the very least, it's another reminder of how careful one must be with sources.
Shields joined the Illinois militia to hunt down Black Hawk, a Sauk leader who attempted to peacefully reclaim promised land until the state militia attacked him in a surprise assault. Black Hawk led a military response to this escalation and was promptly chased across the Midwest. This was James Shields' introduction to military service. Shields' growing reputation was built on his success as a military man in warfare against the Sauk people.
Shields soon entered the sphere of American politics, with election to the Illinois State House of Representatives in 1836. By 1839, he was serving as state auditor, just in time for an economic disaster.
The young state of Illinois was in serious debt, and the state auditor was forced to take some contentious measures in order to recover its finances. His most unpopular action was barring the use of Illinois paper currency. Citizens had to discontinue the money they had and revert to silver and gold.
Coming up on his second potential re-election to the auditor position, Shields was poised for criticism. Partisan lines were drawn, and one colleague from the state legislature of the opposing Whig Party took aim at the young Democrat. Abraham Lincoln, roughly the same age as Shields, took to the newspapers, publishing critical letters under fake names, most notably as Rebecca. Mary Todd, Lincoln's girlfriend, also gave her pass on the letters. Unbeknownst to Lincoln, she even took on writing the Rebecca letters after he had stopped. The fiery young couple produced a steady stream of criticism for Shields.
The letters exposed James Shields as a perpetual sexual harasser. They pointedly referred to public incidents where women stood up to Shields as he attempted to grope them. Describing a moment witnessed by the Lincoln couple as the 36-year-old Shields propositioned a woman named Julia Jane, historian Mark David Epstein wrote, "Abe and Mary Todd happened to be seated opposite Julia Jane and her unrelenting suitor James Shields at a dinner party. He importuned, meaning he made sexual advances toward Julia, and would not take no for an answer. Julia was out of patience with Shields' uninvited attention, his pressing next to her at dinner parties, his hand perhaps wandering under the table." End quote.
In response to this violation, Julia grabbed a sewing pin tucked into her waistband and stuck Shields with it. Mary Todd couldn't help but later mock Shields in one of the letters, saying,
"You say that Mr. S. is offended at being compared to cat's fur and is as mad as a March hare, that ain't fur, because I told about the squeezin'. Now I want to tell Mr. S. that rather than fight, I'll make an apology, and if he wants personal satisfaction, tell him only come here, and he may squeeze my hand as hard as I squeezed the butter."
Not all of Mary Todd's jokes land today, but regardless, Shields was incensed at the mockery of his sexual harassment. He demanded to know who Rebecca was. He went to the editor of the paper, who revealed it was Lincoln. Lincoln was the next stop for Shields, who confronted the lawmaker furious. Things heated up, and soon a duel between the two men was imminent.
Being challenged, Lincoln got to lay the ground rules for the engagement. He set the fight in a pit on a place called Bloody Island. The men would take a boat to reach Bloody Island on the Mississippi River. Dueling was, for some reason, illegal in Illinois state borders. In this pit was a wooden board. The men would not cross this board and reach each other. Well, fine. It won't make a difference to the marksman Shields, except they wouldn't be fighting with pistols. Lincoln's weapon of choice for the duel was the broadsword. Lincoln said, "I didn't want the damned fellow to kill me, which I think he would have done if we had selected pistols."
The barrier between the men, in combination with the scabbarded weapons, gave the 6'4" Lincoln an edge over the 5'9" Shields.
Oh, wow. For reference, I'm 5'9".
What?
Hmm?
You're 5'7".
The fateful day arrived in fall of 1842. Two Illinois lawmakers crossed the river, laid anchor on Bloody Island, and jumped in the pit.
Lincoln really wasn't expecting things to go this far. He figured the blatantly ridiculous conditions for the duel would be the end of it. But Shields didn't back down from the fight.
In a final attempt to intimidate Shields, the lanky Lincoln took a swipe and severed a branch from a nearby tree.
Shields wasn't backing down.
Until two friends interfered and talked them through their reconciliation.
Yeah, anticlimactic. It is said that Lincoln and Shields were laughing about the situation on the boat ride back. Lincoln would be embarrassed by the memory of the event for the rest of his life.
The colleagues returned to Illinois, where they were both climbing ever higher in state government.
The next position for Shields was on the state Supreme Court. He was appointed after the previous justice, Stephen Douglas, was elected to Congress. Presiding over the court, Shields again came face to face with Abraham Lincoln, who argued cases in front of him.
Shields built a reputation as a legal mind and a promoter of imperial expansion. Consequently, in 1845, President James K. Polk appointed Shields Commissioner of the General Land Office. Shields oversaw the platting, mapping, distribution, and resale of new land acquired out west.
Polk and Shields were both promoters of aggressive territorial expansion. Now, what aggressive territorial expansion means is we will aggressively take this territory. Polk branded himself more or less as a warmonger, and he was ready to put that label to use south of the border, in Mexico. Polk first offered to buy the land stretching from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande, which today spans southern Texas and southern California. Mexico refused his offer, and Polk responded aggressively by sending in 4,000 troops, and Mexico, understandably, defended the region. Polk then declared war, claiming that Mexico had been the instigator for the attack.
The U.S.'s reasons for going to war with Mexico were flimsy. A blatant disregard for the sovereignty of the Mexican people was front and center. James Shields was compelled once again to serve America's imperial pursuits.
On July 1st, 1846, Polk appointed Shields as a brigadier general, and Shields went from being in charge of mapping out and distributing land to being in charge of taking it. Less than a year after his appointment, Shields saw his first combat.
At the Battle of Cerro Gordo, Shields served as Major General. During the battle, a grape shot ball lodged itself in his lung. It was believed to be fatal, and he was reported dead. Of course, we know that Major General Shields survived. Thanks to an unconventional battlefield operation, he was put back in command.
Shields led his men to victory at the battles of Contreras and Churubusco. His most consequential action was in the siege of the Mexican castle of Chapultepec.
The castle served as a military school in Mexico City. There, boys as young as 13 refused to evacuate and instead chose to stay and defend their country. They were mixed in with the army opposing James Shields and his comrades.
Shields' forces were the first to enter Mexico City, a decisive victory nearing the end of the war. Thanks to the efforts of Shields and his fellow officers, the war ended, with America taking Mexican land from Texas to California, and with Shields building his reputation further. As many as 25,000 Mexican men, women, and children died in the Mexican-American War.
His service up in 1848, Shields was appointed governor of the Oregon Territory by President Polk. Shields opted instead to head back to Illinois, where he was promptly elected to Congress.
Entering the U.S. Senate chambers for the first time in 1849, Shields represented Illinois as a Democrat for 6 years.
His most famous speech took place during this time. Arguably, it was the most memorable moment of his congressional career. It outlined his support for the expansion of the American empire. It supported the admission of Texas and California into the Union. As the country saw the Civil War looming over the horizon, Shields struck a tentatively optimistic note. In a speech, one of his biographers described as, quote, saturated throughout with the spirit of patriotism, the spirit of liberty, and the spirit of wisdom, end quote. Directly from his speech.
I think we may conclude, and joyfully, that heaven still smiles on this favored land, that glorious stars, the appropriate emblem of this great republic, are not destined to set in darkness and blood, but to illumine for I hope forever, the broadest and brightest political firmament that ever sheltered liberty, civilization, and humanity. It also spoke out against the expansion of slavery, but said the South should keep it and let it die out over time. He wanted to avoid a civil war. There is one piece of policy, though, that cannot be summarized. Again, the following are the actual words of James Shields himself from that same speech. I may be permitted to add that the effect of abolition at this time in the South would prove most disadvantageous to the slaves. I think the Negroes would be the principal sufferers by the change. All I have seen and heard and read convince me that where there are two distinct races in the same community, one inferior and the other superior, like the Negro and the white race, a state of mild and gentle slavery is the safest and happiest condition for the inferior race. Equality of rights and equality in the hard struggle of life result in the insensible but certain extermination of the inferior race. You may give the slave liberty if you please, but that very liberty is his destruction. If you emancipate the slaves and wish to save the Negro, you must separate the races. God only knows how this is to be done, but it is my solemn conviction that the universal emancipation of the African race of this country would lead to the gradual and insensible but certain extinction of that race. The history of this very country proves the truth of this assertion. Where now are the Indian tribes that once roamed in wild freedom over this continent?
At a time when many of his colleagues and countrymen were arguing that slavery was an immoral and unjust assault on human rights, James Shields believed that black people were better off remaining slaves or leaving the United States altogether. He believed if free black people coexisted with white people, that black people would go extinct. In a speech which shared the vision of an expanded American empire, James Shields made clear that his version of an American empire would be primarily white.
Shields failed to win re-election, as his fellow Democrats and their pro-slavery platform lost favor. He left Illinois.
In lieu of cash payments, the U.S. government often paid soldiers with land. Land like the kind out west Shields was integral in dividing up a decade before. This was how he became the proud owner of several hundred acres of land near a young city called Faribault in Minnesota Territory.
Shields, with his nephew Charles, moved to Minnesota in the spring of 1855. He started a farm near what is now Hunt's Lake.
This place, initially called General Shields Colony, was made up of lakes, islands, and fertile black soil. The projection of railroads promised trade and business networks bolstered already by the lucrative river trade. All of this appealed to Shields, as it did to many Irish immigrants soon to come to his developing village.
With Ireland's Great Famine devastating the country only 9 years before Shields settled down in Minnesota, by the time he got here, Irish refugees, desperate for some familiarity, acceptance, and stability, fell in line behind one of the most famous Irish Americans of the day. The land was sold cheap to be accessible to these destitute refugees.
Remember, Irish immigrants to America found themselves segregated and discriminated against for several generations. To have a community of their own in this new land may have seemed like a godsend to them.
Irishmen weren't the only disenfranchised group in Shields' colony. Shields, quote, permitted the use of some land to the indigenous Dakota people. Their land was secluded to a small strip on Shields Lake called the General's Island. By the end of spring 1855, the village of Shieldsville had its framework in place. It was the first organized Irish community in Minnesota.
Moving west, settling in places like Shieldsville, Irish immigrants were starting from nothing. They had chances in the West like they had few other places in the world. This opportunity was near impossible to find in their famine-stricken Ireland under British rule, but it was opportunity only afforded to them if they were willing to make refugees of the land's original keepers. it's also worth noting that for ambitious profiteers, encouraging poor whites to move west was a way to build up American presence in Indian Territory, hastening eventual land seizure and statehood.
Shields invested in his new colony. He received an invitation to meet with one Alexander Faribault, who was facing an avalanche of new settlers moving into his town.
Impressed by the national reputation of Shields, Alex asked him to join Faribault's townsite company, making him head attorney and one of the founding fathers of Faribault. Shields was given ownership of much of the land and was in charge of promoting the town to his contacts out east.
Shields, as head attorney, was simply corrupt. As he issued titles and deeds for land in the young village, he charged patrons for his services even though he was obligated to do it at no charge. As he divided time between Shieldsville and Faribault, he was accused of having, quote, utter deafness to charitable appeals, end quote, from the Faribault community. He was becoming a controversial man in the county.
Nevertheless, he found occasions to commune with the townspeople. Shields made promoting and supporting local religion a personal priority. A number of Catholic churches were supported by or built on land provided by James Shields.
The following story is attested to in only one source that we are aware of. But what it says about how Shields was perceived and about his relationships with the people living in his town is worth considering, even if we must take the facts cautiously.
The winter of 1855 was harsh, and the food the local Dakota depended on was devastated by these harsh conditions. At this time, they stole several cows from Shields' farm.
Farm workers tending to Shields' land tracked the cows to General's Island. And when they demanded the cows back, a heated argument ensued.
From the source, describing Shields' reaction to this news, quote, "The general, who was very high-tempered and combative, flew into a passion, denounced the returned men as cowards, and said if he had a score of the brigade he led in Mexico, he would whip all the Sioux in the vicinity, and said that he would go alone and take his cattle from the thieving Sioux, and that he would blow the brains out of the first Indian who would interfere with him." End quote. Sioux was a term that whites often used to refer to the Dakota people. It's not how they knew themselves, though it was later adapted by some tribal groups, as a quick clarification.
A small crowd of men joined Shields to travel to General's Island. Shields confronted the leader of the Dakota gathered there. When he didn't budge on keeping the cattle, Shields unholstered a 2-barreled pistol, placed it against the man's head, and demanded his cattle back. At the threat of point-blank death, the man agreed to return the cows. A critical source of food for the people gathered on the island was gone. This source claims the man nearly killed by James Shields was called Inkpaduta.
Still struggling, the residents of the island continued to resort to begging or occasionally stealing to survive. Dakota were not hired for work and received no payments promised by United States treaties.
Sometime in the warm months of 1856, James Shields and members of Shieldsville stomped out to the island. As the Dakota men, women, and children watched, Shields and his company tore down their teepees and immediately ordered that all Dakota leave the area. When some men protested, they were, quote, roughly manhandled, end quote. Just like that, all several hundred people were violently erased from the Shieldsville community. General's Island belonged now only to James Shields.
There are reasons to doubt some of the details in this story. For example, the source has an unreasonably specific knowledge of exactly what James Shields had said, even though it was published more than 50 years later. Further, the presence of Inkpaduta is suspicious. Inkpaduta, after leading a small rebellion in 1857, had become a near mythological figure in Minnesota. By the time this source was written, he was often used as a stand-in for defiant Indians in local tales.
That being said, several reliable sources do confirm that groups of Dakota people indeed took up residence on the island in Shields Lake, and that members of Shieldsville's white community forcibly, violently removed them. What sources disagree on is whether the exodus took place during Shields' time in Minnesota. and it's possible that a forced removal of traveling Dakota people took place more than once in Shieldsville. When reports of Inkpaduta's raid came in, we do know that Shields raised a company of 100 men to form a militia, put up pickets around Faribault, and began stoking paranoia about the Wapakuta.
The shock of the frontier violence was one factor helping push Minnesota Territory to lobby for statehood, which was granted in 1858. Shields' influence was large in the newborn state. He led the creation of the Minneapolis and Cedar Valley Railroad and was, with Henry Rice, elected as the first senator representing Minnesota in the United States Congress. Within the next few years, however, the Republican Party took over Minnesota and the Democrat James Shields lost re-election. He left Minnesota.
There is very little known about the woman James Shields married. Unfortunately, we don't know of any photographs of her. Her name was Mary Ann Carr. Mary Ann Carr was an Irish immigrant, orphaned within a year of her arrival in the United States at age 11. By the time she was in her 20s, she was working as a domestic worker in St. Paul for the family of a judge. The judge left for California to practice law with James Shields, and through this work, Mary met James. James, nearly 30 years her senior, had never married, but evidently took a fancy to his friend's servant. The two became husband and wife on August 16, 1861, and moved to Mexico.
The Shields couple was managing a Mexican mine when the Civil War broke out. James Shields was appointed Brigadier General for the state of California, eventually commanding the 2nd Division of the 5th Army of the Potomac.
Shields resisted the Shenandoah Valley Campaign, Confederate Stonewall Jackson's rampage across Virginia. Over 4 months, Jackson confounded 3 separate Union armies, suffering only 1 defeat over the course of the entire campaign.
Shields engaged Jackson several times in March, leading up to the Battle of Kernstown. As the fighting reached a fever pitch, the 55-year-old Shields sustained a major injury.
As Shields recovered, he sent constant orders to an inferior officer. It was while he was temporarily incapacitated that the battle concluded, a tactical victory for the Union. It was Stonewall Jackson's only defeat.
With the credit for the moment, Shields was promoted to Major General, but his promotion was rejected by the Senate. Shields resigned from the Army and moved back to California in 1863. Despite a victory that could have changed the course of his career, Lincoln reportedly considered naming Shields commander of the whole Army of the Potomac, he left the military for the final time in anger and shame.
In 1866, with the Civil War over, Shields opened a law practice in Carrollton, Missouri. He spent his time as a lecturer and farmer. In 1868, he ran for the state legislature and lost. The results were contested, and after a lengthy political conflict, he was given a year's salary anyways in the wake of the humiliation. A few years later, in 1876, Congressman Benjamin Butler proposed making James Shields doorkeeper of the U.S. House of Representatives. Shields declined.
Meanwhile, James and Mary Shields had 5 children. Mary Jr., who died at age 8, and James Jr., who also died in childhood, were the first 2. James Jr. was reportedly the spitting image of his father. It goes without saying that the deaths devastated James and Mary. They had 3 more children, all of whom survived to adulthood: Charles, Catherine, and Dan.
In 1879, Shields was elected to the U.S. Senate again as a representative of Missouri. 3 months into his service, during a trip visiting relatives in Iowa, he felt a sudden pain in his chest. Minutes later, sitting in his chair, he informed his niece that he was dying. Within half an hour, he was dead at age 73.
James Shields was buried with a military ceremony. His grave was left unmarked.
No one in his circle of friends or family paid for a gravestone marking his final resting place. It remained unmarked for 30 years until Congress stepped in and placed a bronze marker.
James Shields is remembered as the only American to serve as United States Senator from 3 different states. There were several statues made to commemorate his service. One notable depiction is in Washington, D.C., another is here, in St. Paul. In the Senate, James Shields advocated for unequivocal support for American imperial expansion. He opposed the extension of slavery, but believed that black people were better off remaining in bondage. His priority was expanding the American empire, whether it was on the backs of Mexicans, black men and women, or the Dakota. Their rights had no sympathy across his entire senatorial and military career. He accepted the abuse of people held in slavery as within the rights of slave owners. James Shields believed that the races could not coexist. James Shields believed that eventually the inferior people of color would die out, leaving the American empire entirely white. James Shields embraced the promise of an entirely white nation.
It should be noted that other leaders at the time did have concern for marginalized peoples. Some may say he was a product of his time, but people long before James Shields spoke out for the subjugated. And of course, for hundreds of years, marginalized peoples were speaking out themselves for justice. He did not listen to them. As for his treatment of women, people of his own time very clearly saw it as wrong. Women even used pins to defend against his advances. He did not listen to them. Throughout his life, James Shields heard the cries accusing him of wrongdoing, and still, he persisted.
As an Irish boy under England's rule, James Shields had personal experience living as a second-class citizen under an imperial oppressor. The countless Irish Americans he invited to Shieldsville would have reminded him of their shared oppression. Senator and General Shields, in his extensive education and experience, would have known the cost of empire. Still, he used his platform to advocate for invasion. It is not harsh to judge James Shields for his actions and beliefs. He was a public official and performed in the public eye. He dug his own grave knowingly, so he can lie in it. Perhaps there was a reason it was left unmarked.